Charles Darwin, a renowned biologist known for his theory of evolution, which suggested that species today had changed over the course of millions of years, and applied this theory to the human race. However, I think to this day people miss the real reason behind Darwin's decision to come up with this theory. Clearly the man was really telling us about the evolution of Chris Redfield, his favourite Resident Evil character, as he stated many times in interviews with reliable sources. Resident Evil characters have constantly changed over the years from when they were first introduced into the series, gaining new personality traits and losing others, like someone who just watched a Ryan Gosling movie, and none have undergone so many changes than the mad lad Chris Redfield. Seeing as how he holds the record for appearing in the most Resident Evil games, it's no surprise that this absolute legend has undergone the most changes and development over all these years. Of course, other characters like Jill, Leon, and Ada have all changed in their own ways since they came to be, but none of them compare to the peak of humanity that is Chris Redfield. The man who is iconic for so many reasons, like punching boulders, losing all of his co-workers in various horrific ways, and pleading with Leon to fuck his sister. Just some of the reasons why this concrete slab of a man is so iconic. But he never used to be like this. Before I actually talk about Chris, I just want to say that this video will only cover Chris's video game appearances, and also because I'm talking about how Chris has evolved as a character, I'm going to be putting the games in chronological order, rather than in the order they were released. This point only matters for Revelations, just so no one is confused as to why it comes before 5. Chris's introduction to the series began with the first game that Capcom birthed, Resident Evil. For this part of the video though, I'm going to be referring to and using the remakes version of Chris, rather than the original version from classic Resident Evil, simply because I think it does a better job of showcasing Chris as a normal, functioning human being, with real emotions, and also the original Chris looks like this. So yeah, we're sticking with the remake. Although most people can agree that the first Resident Evil is very much Jill's game, Chris is still a pretty good character in it. He comes across as a caring guy, looking out for his friends in both Alpha Team and Bravo Team, and seems genuinely saddened seeing some of them die, kind of sowing the seeds for what was to come later in his life. His relationship with Rebecca is probably one of the best in the game, just because it's so great trying to watch him process how to interact with someone who's upset. I feel like Chris is pretty underrated in the first game, which honestly seems to be because picking Chris makes the whole game a lot harder, as although he takes less damage when attacked, he has 2 less item slots, and isn't a certified lockpicker like Jill is, so he has to find small keys to unlock certain doors, which is a pain in the arse. What is interesting to look at is how Wesker views Chris in this game. We know by now that Wesker brought Alpha Team and Bravo Team to the Spencer Mansion as a way to test the effectiveness of the bioweapons created by Umbrella, and despite this, Wesker still seems to hold some form of respect for Chris. This leads me to believe that despite Wesker being completely mental, he was still able to recognise the Sigma energy that is constantly emitting from Chris.
I'm coming.
Which on its own just shows how powerful the Redfield gene is, which will also be shown in the next game, Code Veronica. Code Veronica's main character is Claire Redfield, as she raids an Umbrella facility in search of Chris, but is unfortunately captured and is imprisoned on Rockfort Island,
where she fights for her life against endless horrors.
Oh, blah blah blah. Sorry Claire, I'm not interested in you. It's all about Chris. While Claire is busy battling hentai monsters, Chris comes to the island she is no longer on to find her, then finds a jet and flies to Antarctica to get Claire back, and convince her to sleep with Leon. Jokes aside, watching Chris do all of that for his sister is very heartwarming, and shows that behind that brain-dead stare, there's an individual who cares about his family. This game also shows us a glimpse of the rivalry that will come into play later in the franchise between the Chad Chris and the Twink Wesker. This version of Chris introduced a lot of great aspects to his character going forward, although I'm really not a fan of his design. He looks like he was ripped out of a generic anime. Now canonically we don't hear much from Chris for a few years, so we'll have to fill in the blanks and hang out with Leon as he peacefully calms down some angered Spanish farmers. In the timeline, we're now somewhere in the early 2000s, so I assume Chris was doing typical early 2000s things like playing Halo 2, listening to Girls Aloud, and watching the live action Scooby-Doo movie on repeat. That was until he got a call to join the BSAA, which leads us into the events of Revelations. This game revolves around the mystery of Terra Grigia, a floating city that was infected by a new virus strain, and Jill and Chris, along with their less interesting partners, are tasked with uncovering the truth of what led to the city's demise. Ignoring Resident Evil 5 for now, this game in terms of storytelling marks the beginning of Chris's meathead era. During this time, Chris went from looking like a normal human to having the body proportions of someone from Gears of War. Chris's time fighting Umbrella over the years has left him with a stern and authoritative attitude, wanting nothing more than to complete his mission and make sure sure that Jill is okay. I'm really not a fan of Chris in Revelations, because although the meathead era is my favourite of all the Chris variants, this version of Chris lacks what made the others so great. He has no charisma and little to no memorable dialogue, feeling more like a background character than some of the actual background characters in the game. This then leads into Resident Evil 5, and luckily Wesker was on hand to give Chris some much needed character development as him and Jill go flying out of a window onto some not so soft rocks. Resident Evil 5 Chris is Chris at his most meatheadedness in the entire franchise. After all these years, we finally got a game where Chris was the main character, allowing us all to revel in his ungodly glory. Sigma male. Chris watched Leon kill an entire village and thought, fuck, that looks really good, I want to do that too. A new virus is released in Africa that turns people into venom, and since the BSAA already knows they're going to lose most of their faceless soldiers, they call in their very own secret weapon to get the job done. And so Chris teams up with Sheva to take down this new virus, find out what happened to Jill, and put Wesker down for good. This is by far the best version of Chris in my opinion. Besides his freakishly big design, his dialogue and voice acting is fantastic.
You're going to judge us? You get all your ideas from comic book villains?
He just feels like one of those classic action movie stars that was solely cast based on the fact that they look like they can fight an elephant in hand-to-hand combat. This game showed us the peak of Chris's and Wesker's rivalry, culminating in some stellar voice lines. An aspect this game did well with Chris was show him warm up to the idea of having a new partner to worry about. Obviously him losing,
I use that word loosely,
Jill took a toll on Chris and made him dismissive of the idea of having a new partner in the form of Sheva, but the game does a great job of showing Chris warming up to Sheva, finally managing to stop simping over Jill once and for all. Chris in Resident Evil 5 is the peak of Chris. He's a man unfazed by almost any obstacle. He treats both men and women equally, isn't afraid to shower in poo, goes toe to toe with a bellend wearing sunglasses when it's not even sunny, and punches a boulder to death. The perfect package of a man. Unfortunately, this bright spark in Chris's life wouldn't last very long though, which leads to the Chris we see in Resident Evil 6. This Chris, at the time, was unlike any other version of Chris we had seen before. Though he is very much in the same vein as Chris from Resident Evil 5 and Revelations, he's a lot more edgy. The constant years of fighting BOWs and getting cooked by Jill has turned him into a jaded captain, trying to keep as many of his men alive as possible, and failing miserably. The comic book one-liners are gone and have been replaced by sexism, which Chris probably picked up from hanging out with Leon too much. It's a saddening sight to see Chris in this state. The deaths of his men hurt Chris in this game. I mean, Finn's death was enough to give him dementia and set in motion his turn into Dark Chris. Whereas in the past, Chris was able to keep his cool in tough situations. Resident Evil 6 showed him to be more rash, nearly getting him and his new partner Pierce killed several times in a vain attempt to exact revenge on fake Ada. Pierce is an interesting character to bring up as well in regards to Chris, because although personally I'm not the biggest fan of Pierce, he's important to Chris's story as you play alongside him throughout Chris's campaign, and Pierce is the one who tries to keep Chris on the right path. Chris's rage often blinds him throughout Resident Evil 6, which causes him to butt heads with Pierce on a few occasions. Then as the game progresses, we see Chris and Pierce stop acting like colleagues and more like friends, and this seems like a turning point in their relationship. Classic Chris is back, baby. Get in. Now all Chris and Pierce have to do is beat the final boss and get out alive. Wait, what? That's not supposed to happen. Playable characters always survive in Resident Evil. Oh well, guess that's another paycheck for Chris's therapist. Chris was ready to quit the BOW killing business after he was done saving Wesker's seed, but Pierce's death convinced him that there was still work to be done, which led to many more years of pain and suffering for Chris. Well played, Pierce, you dick. This brings us to the events of Resident Evil 7. It's been nearly 4 years since the events of Resident Evil 6, and a lot has changed in this time period. BOWs now take the form of creepy rednecks, and people no longer look over their shoulders in this universe. Crazy times, but not as crazy as the Chris Redfield we are confronted with.
I'm Redfield. What the hell is even that?
He's lost all his muscles, seemingly swapped his face with another more generic character, and is now working for Umbrella. Yeah, I've labelled this era of Chris the midlife crisis era, as age seems to have hit Chris pretty hard. Despite this sudden change in appearance, Chris is still a mad lad, working for the newly reformed Blue Umbrella to finish what Ethan Winters started, wiping out the redneck mold gene once and for all, which means hunting down the resident Discord mod, Lucas, who Chris and co discovered had been conspiring with a shady company who manufactured manufactures bioweapons, so Chris takes matters into his own hands and sets out to put Lucas down. Things are never easy for Chris though, as we already know. If you're working with Chris and aren't female, then your chances of survival are practically zero, as these three faceless boys literally found out. There's something that seems really off about this version of Chris, and it's not just his weird new face, but it's also how calm he is. It's a big departure from 5 and 6, where Chris is portrayed as a very emotional individual, but in 7 he seems a lot more reserved and quiet. This is Chris at a stage in his life where he's learned to accept the losses in his life, which is shown when his men are killed by Lucas, yet despite those losses, he's still able to carry on with his mission and see it through till the end, which earns him some much deserved revenge. Though this isn't my favourite version of Chris, it's interesting to see how he changed so drastically from 6. He was no longer a brooding, edgy dick, but the next incarnation would revisit some of these personality traits. The next time we see Chris is in Resident Evil Village, and this version is probably my second favourite Chris evolution, and arguably one of the most powerful on the Chris scale. The final evolution of Chris, if you will. Dark Chris makes an immediate great first impression when he gats Mia in the head, steals Ethan's baby, doesn't elaborate, and leaves. A true Sigma. This game infamously tries to trick you into thinking Chris is now a bad guy, as his 2 encounters before Heisenberg's factory paint him in an antagonistic light. Although he has kind of reverted back to edgy Chris, this version is still very much in the midlife crisis era, shown by his choice of jacket and new haircut. Of course, this edginess was a facade to protect Ethan. Chris believed some tough love could keep his new best friend safe, but as we all know, Ethan has a cock, so it wasn't long before he met his demise. This canon event sends Chris into a frenzy, turning him into a one-man army as he descends upon the village, killing any monster that gets in his way of putting down Miranda once and for all. At this point, I'm certain Chris is a BOW himself. There's been too many red flags throughout the series for my liking. Chris ultimately destroys the mold, loses his best friend again in the same day, takes Ethan's daughter under his wing, and pledges to take out his previous employers for using bioweapons, and that's where Chris's story ends, for now. Chris is one of the most iconic faces attached to Resident Evil. He's been around since the very beginning and has played major roles throughout key events in the story. Some may not like him because of how inconsistent he is in both appearance and personality wise, but for me that makes him one of the more interesting characters in the whole series. He feels like the Peter Parker of the Resident Evil universe, always suffering and never allowed a moment's peace, and yet every time he gets knocked down, he gets back up again and again, which should be an inspiration to us all. Plus he's got tasty looking nipples.